Okay, so it's 6:45. So let's proceed. Good evening, everyone. So thank you for joining us tonight. This is Photography Chismis PH. Tonight's topic is Jules Itier and the voyage that brought photography to the Philippines. Okay, just a run through of the topic. The first photograph of Asia is of Singapore by French Jules Itier. After Singapore, the next destination was Manila in 1844, being the second stop of the Lagrene Mission. While there is an earlier and more widely accepted claim that photography arrived in the Philippines in 1842, no existing images support such proposition. Currently, it appears that the two plates by Jules Itier might be the oldest surviving photographs of the nation. If this is true, it suggests that the Philippines may play a significant role in the broader history of photography, being part of the journey that marked the first global circumnavigation of the medium. Thank you for joining us tonight for episode 18 of the Marties Talks Kwentuhan Session on Philippine Photography, entitled Jules Itier and the Voyage that brought photography to the Philippines. This is Photography Chismis PH. Our goal is to promote meaningful conversations about photography in the Philippines. Reminders and notices. This is a recorded Zoom session. You will be prompted by Zoom for your consent in the recording of this material. Also, this is the fifth time we will have a parallel live stream in Facebook. The recording shall be uploaded to Photography Chismis PH in its various platforms, such as but is not limited to Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify for educational purposes in the aim of contributing to the discourse of photography in the Philippines. Third, this episode of the Kwentuhan Session shall not be monetized. Derived knowledge from this program should be cited accordingly based on the conventions and laws on intellectual property in the Philippines as applicable. Fourth, this Kwentuhan Session will explore a new format. There will be a 15 to 30 minutes uninterrupted talk from the discussant. Afterwards, we proceed with the kwentuhan where we discuss the topic further. Comments and questions shall be recognized accordingly by the host and moderator as applicable. So our home is in Facebook, but the podcast is available also on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcast. And for those who like short form content and photographs, you can visit also our account in Instagram. Okay, with that, first and foremost, we would like to thank Gilles for joining us tonight. So he is with us from France. So I turn over the floor to you, Gilles.
Thank you. So now let me share my screen. Voila. So thanks, Tony, for inviting me to do this presentation. That sent me back to a lot of documents and elements of research that I conducted about 10 years ago. So what I'm going to say today is mostly the outcome of that research which I started in 2011 and which led to the publication of that paper in 2015 in History of Photography, Jules Itier and the Lagrene Mission, in which I was re-evaluating and reconsidering everything we knew about Jules Itier since the early 80s. I personally came to know about his work in 2007, and I was lucky to encounter his work both in a physical form, because there was a daguerreotype of Jules Itier of Singapore in the newly renovated National Museum, and also in an academic form, because the daguerreotype of his signatory of the Whampoa Treaty was reproduced in the book which I was using for my class in photography history in ADM, Nanyang Technological University. That photograph, which was in the book Photography of Cultural History, is widely acknowledged as being, in fact, a very first form of documentation of an event, of a political event. Paul Almasi, in his book L'Histoire du photojournalisme, presented as really marking the beginning of what will become photojournalism about like 60, 70 years later. What we knew about Jules Itier was mostly coming from the research of Gilbert Gimond, who researched Itier in the late 70s and published two articles, one article in two parts in French in Prestige de la Photographie and one article in English in History of Photography. And Itier Gimond was adamant that Itier should be regarded as one of the father of photographic reportage. The French article had that very broad claim a very broad title, Jules Itier, the reporter with 1,000 daguerreotypes. In fact, what we actually know of him are around 120. And that was toned down by a history of photography, which is a lot more serious in the content, to a simple title that said Jules Itier, daguerreotypiste. However, those articles by Gimond were really among the very first papers published that covered the history of photography in Asia. When I started my class, there wasn't much writing about it. I started in 2009, and 2009, there was that book by Terry Bennett, in which Terry was identifying the daguerreotype of Macao down in October 1844 by Itier as the first extant photograph of China. So those daguerreotypes of Macao were actually taken in the course of a journey around Asia that started. He actually entered Asia from Singapore, and then from there on went to Manila, Macao, Canton. Macao was the negotiation of the treaty. Canton was the stay after the signing of the treaty. From there, he went on to Manila again, then Sulu, Java, Vietnam, Turan, and he left on his own with the commercial ships going through Gal and then later on Egypt. Because of a whole lot of uncanny coincidences between Itier's own journey and mine, I became very quickly interested in the character, and I managed to buy online facsimile of his journal, published at the return of his trip around the world. And in the chapter that marked the entry in Asia, in Singapore, there is a mention of the use of the daguerreotype on the 6th July 1844 in Singapore to photograph a temple in Chinatown. And this is the first mention of the daguerreotype in the whole journal, while in fact he had traveled extensively before to go there to South America and South Africa. In the articles of Gimond, there were also, and a lot of the daguerreotypes that we know from Itier are mostly a lot from those articles by Gimond. There's a lot of them as well, about 30 of them actually kept in the Museum of Musée Français de la Photographie in Bièvre, but the covering of the whole trip is actually done in the publication by Gimond. And in those two articles, there were two daguerreotypes, two views of Manila, one view of the Aduana, and one view of the San Miguel district, which was at that time on the outskirts, and it was a street leading out of Manila. So Itier profile, born in Paris in 1802, from a Provençal family. He started his career in Marseille. What is important is he's a very keen amateur scientist, particularly competent in geology and agronomy, and that's what will make much of the content of his journal. He begins to use daguerreotype in Paris in 1842. He will be sent on two missions, one mission by the Ministry of Commerce and one mission by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The first one to Africa, Guyana, Guadeloupe, and the second one to China, all the way to China and back. And those two missions will make him do basically a circumnavigation of the world. He resumes his career in Marseille on the way back from the trip. He buys a property in the Southern Alps, where he will keep all his collection, all the objects that he brought back from the trip. Died in Montpellier in 1877. That's a portrait of him as a teenager. We photograph in the lycée where he studied in Marseille. What is quite important is that in Marseille, he was living with his uncle, Dubois-Aimé, who was one of the very first Egyptologists, because Dubois-Aimé had gone with Bonaparte to Egypt. First use of the daguerreotype in 1842, and we know of 3 views of the roof of Paris by Itier, which are kept in the Musée Carnavalet in Paris. The first trip, he leaves Brest in November 42, then Saint-Louis du Sénégal, where he will conduct a mission to study the commerce of indigo. And from there, he will go back by going through Cayenne. Not very sure for which reason, possibly be something to do with the prison there. And then he will go back to France via Guadeloupe. We know of one daguerreotype taken along that trip in Senegal. What is important with that trip in Senegal is that he keeps a diary. He keeps a manuscript diary of the trip. And then he's going to receive his daguerreotype in beginning of January 1843. And in the manuscript, in the diary, he mentions 2 uses of the daguerreotype. So it's really the first instance of his combined use of writing and photography to tell the story of what he's experiencing as a traveler. The daguerreotype that we know of from Senegal is this one. It's a daguerreotype of the French governor's palace in Saint Louis. The other mention concerned a photograph of a festival, of a Muslim festival. And we have right away in Senegal the combination of both ethnographic image and political image. On the way back from that journey, is called for a more important mission, which is by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is to accomplish it, to go to China to negotiate the commercial part of a treaty with China. This is his traveling trunk, which I managed to trace in a member of the family. And this is a portrait of the plenipotentiary ambassador, Théotose de Lagrene, done by Itier in 1844. What is important is that he will leave for that trip with the intention of writing a book, of sharing his experience of the journey on the way back. This is a quote from at the end, when he's getting ready to leave Macau on August 1845. This land so rich in facts that I had promised myself in my ambitious dream to deliver to the ardent curiosity of Europe. And this is what he's going to do with the combined use of writing and photography in his journals. So the trip starts in Brest in December 43, Tenerife, Rio de Janeiro, because for navigation technicality, you have to cross the Atlantic to take the current and the winds to go across the Cape of Good Hope. Bourbon, he enters Asia in Malacca, but it will be a very brief stay in Malacca. And he truly enters Asia in Singapore, which is really the gate towards the Sea of China, which is where he's going to travel for about a year and a half on 3rd July, 1844. So we have 4 known daguerreotypes from Singapore. This is the one that was in the museum in Singapore when I started the research. What is important to mention is that he's not the first to bring photography to Singapore. When he arrives in Singapore, he's going to stay in the London Hotel, which is run by a Belgian guy, Dutronquois, who had already opened a daguerreotype studio 6 months earlier. And we know about that from an advertising in the Singapore press. And we also know of an arrival of a demonstration of daguerreotype by an American doctor on board of a military ship in the Hikayat Abdullah, which is the chronicles of Abdullah Abdul Qadir, who was the Malay teachers of Raffles. It's not dated exactly, but that demonstration of daguerreotype by an American doctor is around 1841-42. So Itier is not the first to bring daguerreotypes to Singapore, but his images of Singapore are the first to have reached us. And what is important in those 4 images of Singapore is that we have a view of the commercial town, a view of the temple in Chinatown, a view of 2 carriage handlers, Malay carriage handlers, and a view of a horse carriage. With those 4 daguerreotypes, we see how Itier is covering actually all the topics that will make reportage more than half a century later. He covers economy, geography, society, culture, technology, industry. The scope of his photographic investigation really covers all the topics that will make photo reportage later on. From there, he carries on to Manila, where he arrives end of end of July and will stay until beginning of August. And we know of those two daguerreotypes of Manila, which I mentioned. And he carries on to Macau, which is the big destination of the mission, because this is where Lagrene is going to meet with Qing, the representative of the Chinese emperor, for the negotiation of the first treaty between France and China. We know of quite a few views of Macau. It's probably all taken in October 1844 during that first stay, although we know of a view of two of his servants that were, because those are dated, those are not necessarily dated, as some of his daguerreotypes are dated by his hand at the back, but not all of them. So the temple of Matsu, which is the goddess that gave its name to the port. And this is the pagoda. It's a pagoda of Kuan Yin, the goddess, the Buddhist goddess Kuan Yin, the pagoda where the treaty was negotiated. This is the pagoda where the treaty between China and America and the US was signed, negotiated and signed about 6 months earlier. And that was the second treaty between China and a foreign nation, since the first one was the Treaty of Nanjing at the end of the First Opium War, by which England was forcing China to open its door to foreign trading, foreign commerce. With that daguerreotype of the pagoda, we see that very important aspect of the journey of Itier, which is that reportage aspect. Because he's going to cover, there aren't many images, but the few images really give a fair and comprehensive vision of what that negotiation of the treaty was, the place where it was treated, the people who contributed to the negotiation. This is Pansy Chen, first-class Mandarin, with whom Itier is going to develop really a friendship, especially in Canton, where he will go and visit Pansy Chen in its country house outside of Canton, because the foreigners are not allowed within the walls of the city, and they have to stay outside the city. And of course, most importantly, that daguerreotype of the signatory of the treaty, which I talked about already. After Canton, after the signing of the treaty in Whampoa, and from Macau, they travel to Whampoa, which is further upstream on the Pearl River, and then they go back to Macau. And at the end of the volume 1 of his journal, there is a very interesting text in which he gives one of the very few indications on how he perceives daguerreotypes, photography. And the caption is that, very interesting one, there are many topics which astonish only scholars or the meditative minds, and the phenomena of the daguerreotype are in this category. The word phenomena is very important because he really perceived photography as a phenomena, and I will come back to that later on. From there, they go to Canton for a stay in Canton of about a month and a half. All foreigners are meant to stay outside the city in the factories, which is the place where foreigners can conduct trading. He will do all sorts of images and the city, but also again, we see the ethnographic documentation of his journey. These are his servant. This is the country house of Pansy Chen, where there will be a lot of interaction between the Chinese and the French mission, because they cannot go in the Chinese city, so they are hosted for reception in Pansy Chen house. Most importantly, he's going to do that 360-degree panorama of Canton from the rooftop of the American factory on the 7th November 1844, and it is, to this day, the oldest existing immersive photography. There was a panorama of London done in 1842 in London, but the daguerreotypes are lost. We only know that daguerreotype from its engraving in the London Illustrated News. So that panorama, 360-degree panorama of Canton by Itier, is the first existing immersive photography. And I could reconstitute it by research with the museum in Bièvre. From there on, he will go for another stay in Manila and then carry on to Sulu. This is important for the coming of photography to the Philippines, of course, since Sulu is part of the Filipino archipelago. Interestingly enough, there are no mention of the use of the daguerreotype in Luzon, where he basically visited two islands, Luzon and Sulu. No mention of the use of the daguerreotype in Luzon. But there is a mention of the use of the daguerreotype in Sulu. I will come back to that mission, that part of the trip later on. One of a group of horsemen and one daguerreotype of a banyan tree. But those two daguerreotypes are lost. From there will be another part of the mission that will send him to Vietnam, to Turan, for a very political purpose, which is the liberation of a bishop from a French bishop who was living in Vietnam, who had been imprisoned by the emperor of Vietnam. It's a very important stay because it's from that stay we have a very clear example of what is basically the first image showing all the different steps of what will become reportage. Eventful shooting, use of the image in relation to a political text, and distribution in the image in newspaper. He then goes back to Macau to write his mission report. While doing so, he falls sick, and he's dismissed for health reasons. So he leaves the mission and go back to France on commercial ships, on British commercial ships, and he goes back via Sri Lanka, where he will travel quite extensively for about a month in Sri Lanka, and we know of one daguerreotype of Gall, and as well Egypt, where he will go all the way up to Philae on the Nile, photographing quite a number of historical archaeological sites. Remember that he grew up in the house of one of the very first Egyptologists, and his daguerreotypes of Egypt are the second after the daguerreotypes of de Pranger. He resumes his activity in Marseille. He marries an aristocrat, so it's like really going up the social ladder. And at the end of the trip, this is really his trip, his circumnavigation with the number of plates and the number of visits. So we have one plate in Saint-Louis de Senegal. The first plate of Asia are in Singapore. And we see that Singapore is the place which he visited the most, which makes sense because Singapore is really that crossroad of traveling route between East and West. So throughout the whole year and a half spent around Asia, he had on many occasions, he had a few times, many reasons to go back there. Manila, 12 plates, Macau, 15 plates, Canton, 28 plates. So we see that China is really the part of the trip on which he put the emphasis in the use of the plates. That's an important point, which I will come back on later. Sulu, 2 plates. There's a whole trip to Java for which there are no plates, interestingly enough. I suspect that he didn't bother to take his daguerreotype with him there. Ceylon, 1 plate, and Egypt, 24 plates, because we know that he could replenish his stock of plates in Cairo. So it really appears to be the first circumnavigation with a camera down between 1842, the start of the trip is December 1842, all the way to early 1846. This is the remains of the museum that he set up in his house in Veras. So you see how he had a complete geological museum with stones and objects gathered throughout the trips. And this is where he kept his daguerreotype that were found by Gilbert Gimond when he did his research. This is probably one of the last use of the daguerreotype by Itier to do a self-portrait in Mandarin costume in Marseille in 1847. Because after that, what we know, and he was not going to use photography a lot after his trip. Basically, his use of photography is really done between 42 and 46. This is when he really uses the camera on a regular basis. After that, there's very little. And what we know of him in the years 1860, 77, is rather the use of albumen collodion and albumen print. So who was he as a man? He was a custom officer, therefore a soldier in the service of the French state. And this is very important because this is what comes at the top of his commitment. He's a soldier at the service of the state. Anything else comes below that. He's a competent amateur scientist with a particular interest in geology. Physics and technology are also part of, he has a very vast knowledge in science and technology. Paradoxically, in his opinion and belief, he's both a fervent Republican and a Catholic. These two convictions make him a humanist from the Enlightenment, and he really carries the tradition and the belief of the Enlightenment, supporting the ideal of a planetary human fraternity. And this is something that we find very often in his journal, although this idea of human fraternity is also toned down by another idea that France has a civilizing mission to accomplish. And so whatever the mission is doing, whatever he does it with that colonialist vision of the 19th century that European nations are civilizing, bringing civilization to the world. So it's a very interesting combination of that belief in human fraternity. To him, there are no difference in races, yet at the same time, the use of the civilizing mission is undoubtful for him. And that's the way he brings daguerreotype in a groundbreaking manner. So we see how, from both the purpose of his mission and the way he acts and uses the mission at a personal level with his journal and with the daguerreotype, we see that he's really a very important character in the process of globalization that is shaping up at that moment. He's doing it from the point of view of commerce, as the commercial attaché of the mission, and he's doing it from the point of view of visual culture by the introduction of daguerreotype in that part of the world. Luckily enough, I managed to find in the process, because in the article of Gimont, the daguerreotypes of the temple in Singapore, the first mention of the use of the daguerreotype in the journal, that daguerreotype was not reproduced in the two published articles. But I eventually managed to find it in the catalogue of the exhibition presented by the Musée des Douanes in Bordeaux in 91. So there was at least one reproduction of that historical daguerreotype that fitted the description in the journal, in which Itier says, I had taken my daguerreotype with me, and the monk allowed me to place on the altar to take a view of the entrance gate ornated by granite columns. Now, what I came at the end of the journey is that, in fact, there was really a strong possibility for that daguerreotype to be the earliest extant and dated photograph of Asia, which made these two daguerreotypes of Manila the earliest extant and dated photograph of the Philippines. Now, here I have to make it clear that I'm not talking about the first photograph. I'm talking about the earliest extant and dated photograph, which makes a big difference because first always implies some form of competition, some form of nationalistic purpose and agenda. Earliest extant and dated perspective brings in the notion of phenomenology. My personal work is largely based on that work which I did in 1977 before entering my photography school, in which I was studying the relation between photography and drawing painting. With that work, I was really raising the question, photography, painting, time, space, reality, fiction. What happened when photography appeared? When I started my history class in La Salle, I started photography class and I spontaneously introduced photo history to teach hands-on photography, because to me it was important to consider the phenomenon of photography. What is photography is doing beside making images. And I came up with that concept of the constant self-recording mode. The moment photography appeared, the moment technological memory started kicking in, the world entered the constant self-recording mode, a process by which the world is constantly looking at itself existing. So that idea of earliest extant and dated has to be understood not as first, but from the perspective of phenomenology and theory. In other words, which image allow us to see the furthest back in time for a certain part of the world? Which image allow us to see the actual light falling out from outer space on planet Earth that day? In other words, where and when do we place the cosmos threshold for that part of the world? When I started the photo history class, there were very little publication about Asia at that time. This is roughly the things I could get. Yes, mention of the Bombay Times, the first studio in Sydney in 1841, a mention of the use of the daguerreotype in China in 1842. We saw that it's a case as well with Singapore. As for the Philippines, this is what I had. There was that very widely distributed claim, 1842, Sinibaldo de Mas, a Spanish diplomat, offers his service as a daguerreotypist to complement his income. However, very truly documented coming of photography was early 1850s. The American Wood produces daguerreotypes in Manila. He will later open a studio that will remain active until the late 1860s. And this was really what you could find around at that time. This is a page from the Filipina Heritage Library, a page written by John L. Silva, a photo historian, whom I met later on during my research in Manila. And that was like 2008, you see, so 1 year after I started my class in Singapore. And basically, John was repeating those information. Sinibaldo de Mas, here he makes him a spy, 1841, but no traces of any activity, no documentation. And the earliest known photograph are stereo pictures taken in 1860. All this kind of made me raise, because I was on a mission. I mean, for me, yes, researching Itier was one thing, but from the perspective of my cosmos theory, I was really bent on trying to identify which was that threshold image. And because of de Mas' claim in Filipino in 1842, there was a whole lot of question arising. So I started really questioning the de Mas narrative, and I communicated a lot with Jonathan Bess and Gael Newton, the photo curator of the Canberra National Gallery, of the photo gallery in Canberra National Gallery. And I communicated a lot with them around those questions. In the beginning, Gael was quite, because she had written about de Mas in many articles. So to her, it's not something that could be questioned, because it was widely repeated around. Jonathan, however, was a little more doubtful. This is an email with him in which he had found that article about Sinibaldo de Mas by a very important, renowned Spanish historian, well written, very insightful, but no mention of photography. In fact, the more we were digging, the less we would find mention of photography in biography of Sinibaldo de Mas, where the use of photography by Sinibaldo de Mas was very prominent, was in history of photography. And here is an article by Juan Guardiola, a very seminal article that was published in relation with the seminal exhibition, The Colonial Imaginary, in 2008, in which, from that very flimsy mention of the use of the daguerreotype, Guardiola develops a whole narrative about the mass use of the daguerreotypes, while in fact saying at the same time that there were no traces of it. And here he says the oldest photographic images preserved of the Philippines date back to the decade of 1840, although their precise date is uncertain. Two daguerreotypes that present a view of the city of Manila Intramuros, in which we see a flag and a portrait of the photographer Wood, although the latter was probably made abroad and taken to the Philippines when the artist set up his studio in the capital. However, my problem in writing, because my article had been accepted by History of Photography, and Luc Cartland, the editor of History of Photography, was asking me to actually authenticate that claim. I was repeating what Guardiola was saying in his article, but Guardiola was giving no clear source for those claims. There were no mention of a book that was really making that claim physical. So I was really, but Luc was asking me to authenticate that claim. So I had to find a way out. By then, Gaëlle was beginning to realize that something was fishy. So she started investigating the matter with me, and she contacted, Jonathan Bess sent me also a little later another biography in which there is, you see, the mention of the use of photography is down to one line, while Guardiola does a whole paragraph about it. So Gaëlle contacted a biographer a renowned biographer doing contemporary research on Filipino on the mass. And here is what he says. So he acknowledged that there are intellectual links between mass and Daguerre's camera because of some connection of people, but no clear authentication of that he actually used the camera. At that time, he was living in Calcutta Hill and trying to earn a living as a portrait painter, because Dumas was a painter and he was doing painting portraits to make a living. This is mentioned by him. The next 2 years in the Philippines, he wrote an encyclopedic work in which he explains some personal experiences there, but he never mentions the daguerreotype. And when a few years later he lived in China, he once again painted several portraits, but never took photographs. All this suggests that it is not very likely that Sinibado de Mas had introduced the daguerreotype or any kind of photographic technique into the Philippines. As a careful academic, but who knows, history is constantly being rewritten. Intellectually speaking, he had a lively and keen character. He studied art in several schools and is the kind of figure that could be interested in photography, but we have no real evidence. So in short, when I published, since I didn't have any clear authentication of the claim, I could only say this. And it looks very much that this introduction of photography by Sinibado de Mas in 1842 in the Philippines is an unfounded, it's a rumor that is based on an article published in Barcelona in 1910, which has been repeated and repeated over and over again. Incidentally, in Guardiola article, we have the oldest photographic images preserved in the Philippines date back to the decade of 1840, although their precise date is uncertain. There are two daguerreotypes that present a view of the city of Manila Intramuros, in which we see a flag. The view of Aduana by Itier is a view of Intramuros, and we do see a flag on that daguerreotype. So it's most likely that this daguerreotype mentioned by Guardiola in his article is actually the Aduana of Itier. Another important element of the coming of photography to the Philippines is the discovery of a group of 18 daguerreotypes in April 2007 in the Hispanic Society of America in New York City. That was a groundbreaking discovery because they were a stunning set of 18 daguerreotypes, including 13 full plate, which is very rare. The full plates are very, very valuable and very rare, and 5 half plates. Stunning images of Manila, undoubtedly very, very important from a historical and photographic point of view. They were the subject of a very careful renovation, restoration by the George Eastman House. And they were coming along at about the same time as the discovery of some daguerreotypes of 3 Filipino warriors that were researched and published for the first time in 2018 by Prudencio Mateo Perez and dated by him as 1848. And Perez was crediting those daguerreotypes to José María Penaranda. Now, those daguerreotypes of the Hispanic Society of America were researched by an assistant curator of the society, Noemi Espinoza, and we were in contact at the beginning of my research as well. She was doing her research, I was doing my research at about the same time. I published my article in 2016. She only recently published hers in the French photo journal of the French Photo Society, Photographica. The main interest of her paper, I believe, is that she does a comprehensive survey of what we know about the earliest photographers coming to Filipino. So she does mention Sinibaldo de Mas, but she comes to exactly the same conclusion as I. There's no conclusive evidence that he actually did so. What we know very clearly is about William Wood, who opened his studios in the 1850s. I didn't know of that name, I didn't know of that guy, Alonso Bertrand, but apparently she found in some journal in the library in Madrid, a journal mentioning a publicity posted by Bertrand in the Manila newspaper offering his services as a daguerreotypist in 1844. That's a very interesting possible direction to research. Who was that Alonso Bertrand? How did he produce? How did he work in Manila in the 1844? She also mentioned that Roberto Peter Napper, English photographer who worked in the Philippines from 1844-45 to 1856. He used camera, he became a photographer later on in Spain, but there are no clear indications that he actually used the camera in the Philippines. She does mention José María Penaranda because of that publication of that article on those daguerreotypes of the 3 Filipino warriors. Penaranda was a photography lover, and he was the secretary of the governor of the Philippines from 44 to 49. And Claveria probably commissioned Penaranda to produce those daguerreotypes because he was very keen to have those collections of anthropographic photography. And finally, of course, she mentioned Gilles Itier. And at her conclusion is, at this stage of my research, the authors more likely to have made these 18 uncredited images are therefore an important member of the Spanish administration, Penaranda, and a French custom officer passing through the country. However, we know that these are the 3 stays of Itier in the Philippines. The first one was done in 25 July to 5 August 1844. The second one from 15 December to 7 January 1845. During that stay, Itier went for a very long trip inland, south of Manila, all the way to Batangas. And we know that the governor sent Penaranda to accompany Itier on this trip. So it's probably on that trip that Penaranda got acquainted with possibly daguerreotypes, okay, when he met Itier at that time. And lastly, the last day, 20 June to 9 July, where he travels a little north of Manila. Okay, what is important is to mention is that there are no mention of the use of the daguerreotype in all three states. From there on, Noemi goes into a whole debate about, she basically attributes those 18 daguerreotypes of Manila to Itier based on similarity in the composition of landscape. But I mean, how much of the difference can you make in the composition of a landscape? You know, I mean, it's like there's always like there's the view from a top. I mean, you know, the horizon line is already basically at the center. So the stylistic approach, I think, cannot be taken as a clear indication. She also mentions the French stamp at the back of the daguerreotype. But all daguerreotypes, I mean, not all, but a large, most of the daguerreotypes were actually produced in France. So they had a French stamp. The point is that those 18 plates features different stamps. There isn't one single stamp on all 18 plates. And most importantly as well, there are different handwritings at the back of the daguerreotypes. The last point, which makes me very doubtful about the claim that those 18 daguerreotypes are the work of Itier, is that in the 18 plates, there are 13 full plates. Point is, however, that in all known daguerreotypes of Itier, there isn't one single full plate. He always uses the largest half plate and often quarter plate, because his problem was to be as economical as possible in the use of the plates so that he covered the whole duration of the trip. So I'm really doubtful that he would have gone into using 13 full plates to leave them behind in the Philippines. Maybe he did one or two, which he offered to that guy who helped him in his research on the economy and the industry in the Philippines. But to say that the 18 plates are from his hand, I think it simply just doesn't really make sense. So these are indeed those two daguerreotypes that we know. They are indeed the earliest extant dated and identified photograph of the Philippines. A few words about those two daguerreotypes of Sulu lost, because they are actually very important. If they were ever to resurface, they would mark a very important moment in the history of photography, because these would be like very too early photography of a very remote part of the world. The reason for the passage to Sulu is because the Lagrene Mission was meant to negotiate and sign the treaty with China, but in fact, there was also a secret aspect to the mission, which was identifying a place where France could develop its presence in Asia. The reason why the mission was sent is because after the Treaty of Nanjing, suddenly France realized that they had focused all their attention on Africa and the Antilles. They had no port of call for themselves in Asia. And a lot of things were happening in Asia. They were fully dependent on the goodwill of other nations if they wanted to trade in Asia. So yes, go to sign the treaty with China, but also try to identify a possible place where to set up an outpost. And so what happened is that there's a guy called Jean-Baptiste Mallat, who during a trip in the Philippines in the 1830s had noticed that the Sultan of Sulu had not sworn allegiance to the Spanish government in Manila. So there was a very small diplomatic window for France to possibly negotiate something with that Sultan, since he was not officially answering to the Spanish government. However, it turned out to be a real disaster, because Sulu was already a place of very tense situation, as it has been since then. All those conflicts in Sulu between the Muslim and Christian population and so on that wish for independence from Sulu. And so that part of the mission was a rather unfortunate episode where they stormed the village. I mean, it's an unfortunate episode. So this could not happen in Sulu, but this is what Itier is eventually going to identify as possibly happening in Vietnam when he went there for that negotiation of the liberation of the bishop from the Missions Étrangères, prisoner from the Emperor of Vietnam. There's a whole extensive history, story which I cannot go into detail now, but his plate of the fort of Da Nang was used as a frontispiece in his journal to support his analysis of the situation that would indicate the possibility for France to actually set up a colony there. And you see how we have that mission of his, which is at the service of the French state, is not going to question the need for France to have a colony in Asia. For him, this is a must. So those events and those two daguerreotypes taken in Da Nang are of particular historical and cultural relevance. And I will close here with that suggestion that Itier is fundamentally a visionary scientist photographer whose scope of work calls for wider recognition and deeper analysis.
Wow, this is such a treat for us to see your research, especially for us. The Filipino that you're seeing in the group is Roderick Javier. He's also working with Philippine history. So he's a co-faculty in BNIL. So we're the only school in the Philippines that teaches dedicated AB photography program. So that's why we're so amazed with all of these stories, because before finding your article, the two of us also were working on the story or the narrative of Guardiola. So probably later we can talk about that further. No? For now, let me react first to the initial part of your presentation. I know this is a historical, ethnographic, cultural presentation that you did. However, in you holding the photo of Itier in the same place, so you are juxtaposing the original daguerreotype image as opposed to how it looks like right now. It feels so mystical to imagine how light would have felt. How was the phenomenological aspect of that light hitting that place when it was taken? And now looking at it, you went there, you photographed it with your hand stretched with the older version. It feels a bit mystical in the sense that you were playing around.
I'm a very mystical person.
Yeah. Well, it's not the first time we've seen historical photographs, but yours is a bit on a different level. Because just like what you said, depending on the country, what you were holding in your hand was the first time that photography manifested itself in that place, in Asia.
Yeah, it's the image that allows to see the furthest back in time. So it's not about being the first. It's about seeing the furthest back in time. And it's because, I mean, I came to history of photography because of my interest in theory and phenomenology. And so I really looked at history of photography from that perspective, rather than just documenting. I hope that Han Feng can certify for this. I was really trying to, it was a 12 weeks course in which, of course, there was a lot of historical element aspects, but I was always trying to bring that, that theoretical, phenomenological dimension forward. The question of what is photography actually doing beside making images? How is it messing up with time and space, with our perception of time and space? That's like really my
maybe